Love that. All right, guys. So I'll go ahead and move over to the next question, which is kind of sort of related. It's about polling location closures. All right, guys. So I'll give you some context. So since the historic 2013 Supreme Court case, Shelby v. Holder, which removed several key voter protections to include redistricting and polling locations, over 1,600 voting locations across 13 states have closed. So how does this reduction in accessibility affect voters across America?
Yeah, I mean, the polling place reductions are obviously affect access right away. I think in 2016 we saw also somewhere, I can't remember how many, I think it was somewhere between 6 and 800 polling locations closed along the southeastern seaboard. We also know that these tend to be closed in Black and brown neighborhoods and in places that are not as high income. I think that over and over again, you see either the moving of polling locations or the closing of them to really try to, again, all of this is sort of a death by 1,000 paper cuts effort to reshape the electorate. Instead of having politicians accountable to the people, they want to reshape who is actually participating and who they have to be held accountable to by. So I think we also know that in places like Georgia, the average white voter waits 30 minutes less in line than the average Black voter. These sorts of things cause huge problems. We know how to get 80% of the population through a system of voting if we have the political will to do so. We can get like a man on the moon, but we can't figure out how to get high numbers of people through election processes without shutting down locations. I think it's really about having the will. The thing that changed in the voting rights case, Shelby v. Holder, is that we lost the enforcement mechanisms behind the laws that really kept some of these states from being able to have mass shutdowns of polling locations and things like that. They would have before had to report that, and now don't. So I think that's the unfortunate thing. I think it was, and we have a law professor here, so I'm going to kick it to the law professor soon. But I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg that said, when they gutted the Voting Rights Act, she said, just because it's not, because you have an umbrella doesn't mean it's not raining, because they said, we're post all of that, it's not necessary, was sort of the argument. And now we've seen since then that people are having to overcome the problems that these states, some states are worse actors in this than others, are causing. So, and with that, let me kick it over to Dr. Wilson to talk a little bit.
The setup here. I mean, like the thing about Shelby versus Holder that's really interesting is that, the Supreme Court essentially said, look, this law is faulty because you haven't updated your data, right? You haven't updated the data about where racial discrimination is happening, where gerrymandering is happening. You can't hold these southern states to a standard that you're not holding the rest of the country to without proving it. And now this is ironic coming from the Supreme Court that is very, very hostile to social science data. There was a case in the 60s where Justice William Brennan asked the conservatives on the court, and it was like, well, what are you afraid of? Too much justice? And their argument was, wait, we can't have the courts clogged up with all these cases. So it's a kind of catch-22 when you really think about it. You bring too much data, they're like, wait, we can't acknowledge that. We need people to go through court really quickly. But if you don't bring any data, they say, wait, the law's invalidated, right? So I think that's important to remember about these kind of like what's happening in the South and also some places in the North, particularly New York, disturbs me a lot, and so does Wisconsin, is to remember, right? Like both this and with the voter ID situation is, what is your ability to raise hell, right? I mean, the reason the 60s and the 50s were so important, and even the 20s, right, is thinking about like these people are willing to raise hell, and not just hell, holy hell. The reason marches were so important is because we have the internet. You could literally stop the world from functioning for hours at a time because you block the mobility of people, right? So the question is, how much is your pain tolerance relevant in comparison to the state? And so I think a lot of us have to kind of remember, like back when we were children, I think for me, I was obsessed with like double chocolate fudge cookies and snickerdoodle cookies. And my grandmother was like, you can have one a day. And I was like, okay, I obey by the rules. I couldn't reach the cookie thingy on the counter. And then I realized I could climb on the counter. But until I could do that, I obeyed the rules. And so I think that one thing that Andrea was getting at is that like, you obey the rules so you can change them. And I know for me, I love my grandmother to death. She's the reason of the politics that I have. But I don't want my grandmother legislating my life long after she's dead. Right. And so part of this is like, do you want your grandparents and your great grandparents, folks that, my God bless them, won't be here in a few years, a decade, what have you, legislating the world that you're going to have to live in? And further, we must realize that most of the laws that are promulgated, produced, enacted, or what have you, affect the regulation of the life of all of us under 40 or 50, right? So who the hell do you want controlling who you love, who you sleep with, what you eat, what you drink, what you smoke, what time you do it, how you can vote? And so I think all of this is important, and the Supreme Court is obviously important, but all of this rests upon the fact that none of our rights are self-executing. The only rights you have are the rights you practice. The only rights you have are the rights you enforce. And I'm going to stop rambling after this, but we can think about my biggest pet peeve in the legal world, the Fourth Amendment, the idea of a reasonable person. Right. So right now we think about the reasonable person when the police say you're arrested or where you're free to go. It's generally understood as an upper middle class white man. Anyone else approached by the police will feel like, wait, I can't move, I can't go, someone stopped me, my life's in danger, I'm going to go to jail. But these rights don't execute until you say no. I have a right to remain silent. No, am I free to go? Okay, I'm going to leave. And the same thing happens with these polling practices. Whether we're talking about the location of a poll, the redlining of citizenship, tantamount and similar to the ways that houses were redlined, tantamount and similar to the rules about which water fountain you could drink at, tantamount and similar to who you could love and have sex with, Lawrence versus Texas. So I think that there's a long history of the court being too powerful. And sometimes it's only too powerful because individuals don't realize the power that they have as individuals, both in the voting booth and the ability to protest, but also, as someone mentioned in the chat, establishing a buddy system, a network system. Even if you don't like your roommate, you want them to go to hell. Well, today, y'all both need marijuana to be legalized, so go and vote. Right? So I think we have to realize that sometimes our interests are more deeply intertwined than our annoyances or even our affinities for each other. And that's the work, realizing that my freedom is tied up with yours, and I'm not doing this for you or for someone else, but we're doing this together. And that's the only way we get through, is to get past and to cast that vote.
Awesome. Awesome. Yes, please, Janice.
Oh yeah, no, that was I love everything everyone is saying. It really feels like it's coming from the heart. I also wanted to kind of jump in. I think it is, kind of thinking about like pain tolerance, right? And of course, like each generation has their own pains and traumas. So it's obviously never to undermine what other people have gone through, and also not to compare. But like it is also kind of an interesting time, especially growing up now, where I had to spend like, COVID, a world pandemic, during like school, right? And school is kind of like a very formative time for a lot of people. So not only, just kind of like the feeling of like being overwhelmed, like so many people like my age went to school where they weren't able to interact with people and form that kind of empathy and compassion because they're just kind of stuck at home just looking at a screen on Zoom, and their only social interaction is maybe like texting their friends' iPhone games. Of course, like I think there are a lot of people that were really able to take that time to hone in on themselves and learn more about how do I create community when my community is taken away from me. But it's also, not only is it COVID, but it's also climate change and also dealing with all this, politics that it feels very overwhelming for for my generation, Gen Z, where it's just kind of like, I think hope is really important. And I think sometimes the news does like to skew towards the negative. So it can be so easy to be like, I give up. Like all this is happening that's out of my control, and I can't do anything about it. So why should I go out there and try to make the world for better? But I think it's also a very like Western mindset too, to believe that you have to be the only person to be solving the solution. Obviously, no individual could ever solve, any giant national complex issue, but also we don't need to. And I think also like, I don't know, for me, what allows me to have hope even during these times of destitute is I think just like I think it's just like reminding myself that there are, believing in something bigger than me. For some people, maybe it's God. For some people, it's community. For some people, it's art. But I think by being able to know that you are attached to something and you are part of something that is bigger than you and important allows you to really be like, okay, and also remind ourselves, our ancestors went through hell, but we're still here.
Mm-hmm.
So like I think having kind of like that knowledge of like, yes, some things are going to take longer for us to change, and that's frustrating, but we can really make it work, and we can at least try our best to make the situation for other people better.
Download myBalbo now on Apple and Google Play stores to watch the full episode of Democracy Downloaded or to start your own roundtable. myBalbo, the home for the next generation of changemakers.